The next thing I want to show you is how to configure or enable remoting. In other words, enable a machine to receive remoting connections via group policy instead of running enable PS remoting. Now, most of what I'm going to show you should work so long as you've got domain controllers running Windows Server 2008 or later. A Server 2003 was not born with the correct GPO templates. Now, that said, even if all your domain controllers are running 2003, so long as you have a computer with, let's say, the Windows 7 RSAT, it comes with all the right templates and it can put them in your domain for you. So I'm just going to get into the group policy management console here. I'm going to, you know what, let's just edit the default domain policy. I'm not going to edit these things right in my domain because I've already configured everything, but I'll show you where everything is. So the first thing we need to do is get WinRM listening on an IP address, one or more IP addresses, using HTTP or HTTPS. So this is setting up the listeners. And where we're going to find this is under Policies, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Windows Remote Management, right here, under the Service piece. Now the name of this particular setting has changed a couple of times. It used to be called Allow Automatic Configuration of Listeners, and it's changed now. I'm in a 2012 domain. This is the Windows 8 RSAT. So now it's called Allow Remote Server Management through WinRM, but it's the same thing. And you're going to enable it, and then you enter the filters of the IP addresses you want it to listen on. And you can put an asterisk in there, and that will allow it to accept messages on any incoming IP address. So there's lots of examples down there of the different ways that you can support those filterings. Now this will automatically set up HTTP listeners. This does not give you the ability to automatically set up HTTPS listeners because there is no group policy way of connecting an SSL certificate because each machine has to have its own SSL cert. So if you're going to be using HTTPS, you're already going to be visiting each machine in order to get a certificate installed and connected. So there's no reason to do that centrally through group policy. And we also need to make sure that the WinRM service itself is actually set to run. Now look, group policy can't start the service for you. What we can do in group policy is set the service to start automatically, and then the next time that computer restarts, WinRM will start along with it. But if you need it to start automatically, you're probably going to, if you need it to start now, you probably want to come down to Windows PowerShell and do that. You can use get service, start service. You can use Windows Management Instrumentation. There's a number of different ways you can reach out to the computer and have it start that service now. But what I'm going to show you is how to actually configure it. So we're under computer configuration still. We're going down to Windows Settings. We're going down to Security Settings. We are going to System Services, and then I need to look for Windows Remote Management, which should be near the bottom of the list. Windows Remote Management, WinRM. Define this, set it to automatic, and you're good to go. So that's getting that set. You are probably going to want to configure a Windows firewall exception. So under Computer Configuration, let's go back to Administrative Templates. We're going to go down to Network, and then Network Connections, and then Windows Firewall, lost track there. And then which of these profiles you configure kind of depends on the machine. I'm thinking if you're applying a group policy object that the machine pretty much has to be in a domain. So you're probably going to be configuring the domain profile, right? So you've got one setting here, Windows Firewall, allow local port exceptions. This is right here. That simply allows local administrators to configure firewall exceptions using the control panel. This doesn't actually create any exceptions. However, that might be exactly what you want in some situations, which is why I wanted to point it out. But there's another one which is define inbound port exceptions or inbound program exceptions, which is right here and there. So we're going to do an inbound port exception. We can enable this. We can define the port exception, which if we're just doing HTTP would be 5985 by default. So we'll set that to be okay. And so that now allows that to happen. You can do just a port, you can provide transport, you can put scope if you want it for all networks, you can limit it to specific IP addresses, you can get very, very, very specific with this. So that gets your firewall configuration. And that should be most of what you need. Now, once you've got this thing enabled, you can do some more granular management right from within PowerShell itself. So over here, I'm going to change to my WSMAN drive. You'll see that I do have a connection to my local host, which means that remoting is enabled on my local computer. I could connect, and I forget the command, so this is a good time to do command discovery. Get command, where the noun contains WSMAN. And we have connect WSMAN computer name. Excellent. Let's connect to my DC. Fingers crossed. Okay, takes just a second, but now if I look at this WSMAN drive, I've got a connection to my DC as well. CD/DC. And the service stuff, the things that are WinRM related, is under service. So this is my root security. This is basically the access control list that applies to everything by default. Max concurrent operations, the maximum number of incoming connections. Do not allow unencrypted. So this is an interesting thing. Even without running HTTPS, we can apply an application level kind of symmetric encryption to the channel. So it's not going to protect things like your credentials, but it will serve to at least obfuscate the traffic that's flying over the network. We've got a container for authorization. So if we look in there, these are the enabled protocols. You'll see that Kerberos and Negotiate are turned on by default. We can see our default ports. So these are default listening ports, 5985 and 5986. We've got our filters for what IP addresses we're going to allow to be hooked up. We're not turning on the old compatibility HTTP and HTTPS listeners. The first version of this technology listened on ports 80 and 443, which is kind of stupid because that would conflict if you tried to use them on a web server that was already using those ports. But if you enable the compatibility listener, then it will also listen on 80 and 443. And then you've got this sort of ultimate on-off switch, allow remote access. So those are the server-side things for WinRM. We can also go into shell, and this is stuff that's specific to PowerShell. Do I allow remote shell access? How long am I going to allow a connection to sit idle before I kill it? How many users can connect to PowerShell simultaneously? What's the maximum amount of time they can allow a session to run? How many processes can each remote shell support, and how much memory can it use? And if I've got 10 max users, let each of them open up to 30 shells. So that's kind of cool. And then on the listener side, you can see we have one listener set up, so I'll just take a look at this. It's listening on all ports, all IP addresses to HTTP at 5985. There's no host name configured, doesn't need to be. It is enabled, and there's no certificate hooked up because it's just HTTP. Let's go back up a couple levels. There's one more section. The client section is used when I make outgoing connections. So I'm not allowing unencrypted. I can change the default ports for outgoing connections. Here's that trusted hosts thing I mentioned, and we're going to play with that later. And the authorization protocol or authentication protocols that I will use. Almost all of these settings, if you were paying attention, are actually replicated in the group policy. So you can create these things centrally in a GPO and push them out to all of the computers in your domain. So that's all of that. I don't think we really need to play with a whole bunch of those configuration settings just yet. We are going to get into some of them, but I think that's probably a pretty good overview for right now. So let's do some basic operations. Enter PS session. This is going to allow me to make a one-to-one connection to a single computer. I can give it a single computer name, and that name needs to be resolvable in DNS so that I can actually turn it into an IP address and connect to it, but it also needs to be that machine's canonical name in Active Directory. And there, I'm in. I can do pretty much whatever I want to from here, so long as I've got permission to do it. I can run commands, process. I see the results on the screen. I'm not actually doing a remote command line. That's not quite what's happening. In fact, if you look at the little pop-up, the F7 pop-up, you can see that it's my local console that's remembering all these commands I typed. When I hit enter, the command gets sent to the remote computer, it runs it, brings the results back, and displays them on my screen. If I pipe this to get member, it shows up as a system.diagnostics.process. So, if for all intents and purposes, I'm there. The under the hood implementation is a little bit different, but I'm there. All right, so exit when you're done. Now let's do the one-to-many, invoke command. There's a couple of ways you can do this, and we're going to talk about some of the different permutations here. But the simple one is to give it a script block of whatever command you want it to run. Let's do get event log, log name, security, newest 10. Send that to one or more computers, and hit enter. Boop, there you go. You'll notice in the very last column, there's a PS computer name that indicates which computer each result came from. That's a neat little extra thing that invoke command does for you. Now, let's take a look at the help for this. There's a lot of different versions of this. I specified a script block. You could also give it the path to a local file. PowerShell will read that off of your computer and transmit the contents to whatever computers you specify. Now, if you need to connect to something other than the default PowerShell endpoint, you can specify that. You can specify an alternate port. So if you need to use something other than your client configured default, and if you want it to use HTTPS, it's here. If you specify more than 32 computer names, then what it does by default is it lines them all up in a queue. It will talk to 32 of them simultaneously because that's the default throttle limit. You can raise or lower that throttle limit. As it finishes, it'll go grab the next one off the queue. So it's talking to up to 32 or up to the throttle limit in parallel. Raising that throttle limit really doesn't have an effect on the remote computers because they're only doing one thing. It's your local computer. You basically have to have a thread of PowerShell running and some memory set aside for every simultaneous connection. So if you've got a workstation with 64 gigs of RAM and 4 processor cores, then you can jack that throttle limit up as high as you want to, and I think you should tell your boss that's the kind of machine you need. If you're specifying something other than the default authentication, that's where you would tell it that. You can have it hide the computer name in the output, but the computer name is still there. It's still attached to the object, so you can still sort and group and all that stuff. It just hides it for you so it doesn't show up in the output. Here's a good example of that. Let's clear the screen so this is a little more readable. I'm going to add hide computer name, and then I'm going to pipe this to format table, group by PS computer name. Now look what's happening here. This is getting sent to the remote computer. The results are coming back as objects, and on my local computer, I'm formatting them. And see, by grouping them using format table, I get a nice little fresh set of table headers for each computer that was there. I could then out that to a file if I wanted to. Right? It's okay to use out file because that's one of the 3 or 4 commands that is allowed to come after a format command. So, pretty cool stuff. There's lots more permutations for us to cover, so I just wanted to get these basics out of the way. And look, this is a good time. If you haven't gotten your labs set up to play with remoting yet, this is an excellent time for you to go ahead and start doing that. This is really fun stuff to play with, but it can also be a little tricky. Well, not tricky, it can be picky. This is a good time for you to start playing with it. Get these basics under your belt, and then we'll build up into the more complicated stuff. Now, while I've got you here, there's one more thing we should talk about, and that's the double hop. Not like the double tap in Zombieland. So the basic deal is this. You start here, and you establish a connection to this machine. Now that means your credential gets delegated across the network to that machine. so that it can perform any tasks you ask for as if it was you. That's the way we want things. But this is kind of like getting back to loaning the keys to the car to your kid. You hand your keys to the kid, and the kid's allowed to drive the car, but the kid's not allowed to loan the keys to one of his friends. That would be another hop. For example, if you ask this second machine to perform a task against that machine, that's a second hop. Your credential by default cannot be delegated across that second hop. Now, there are certainly times when you might give your keys to your kid and say, look, don't hand these to any of your friends, but if your mom or your sister needs the keys, it's okay to hand it to them. In other words, you can specifically authorize certain machines as being allowed to redelegate your credentials, your token. And there's a couple of ways to do that. One way is to simply configure your Active Directory domain to support Kerberos delegation. Another way, which is valid in Windows Vista and later, is to use the CredSSP authentication protocol. So let me show you where that lives. We are going to go to my WSMAN drive. We're going to CD into the local host configuration. I'll CD into the client and then into auth. And you'll see that CredSSP is a valid protocol. Now this is the client side. This is what my client is allowed to use when it attempts to make an outgoing connection. There's another version of this on the service side. And this is what it is allowed to use for incoming connections. Now in reality, I probably would configure this through a group policy, and you already saw the section of group policy that contains this. So you have to do two things. You actually have to enable the protocol, and you can run this command, enable WSMAN CredSSP. Now what you do is you run it first on the client, the machine that is initiating the connection, and you type -role client and then -delegate computer, and you create a string of the computer that is allowed to delegate your credential. Now a smart string, at least in a domain environment, would be something like *.yourdomain, because that means any computer in your domain would be trusted for further delegation. Now then, on the machine where you will be connecting to, across the first hop, you run it with -role server, and you don't specify delegate computer. That allows that machine to receive a redelegatable, is that even a word, a redelegable credential, and it allows it to pass it off across that second hop. So to take a look at this, because I really think this is something you're going to want to lock down more in group policy. Let me get over on my Windows 8 machine now where I've got these tools. There's also a domain policy you're going to have to turn on. So let's go into a group policy object. Obviously you could configure this in any group policy object. This domain-wide thing, the first thing I'm going to show you though, probably does need to go in your default domain policy so that this affects the entire domain. This is going to be under computer configuration, it's going to be under policies, and it's going to be under administrative templates, and then we're going to be under system, and then we're going to be under credentials delegation. And it's allow delegation of fresh credentials, allow delegating fresh credentials. So you have to enable that, and then you can add servers to the list that are allowed to do that. And there's a nice big explanation there you can read if you need to know a little bit more. So there's a couple other things. In addition to turning on that protocol, oh, and by the way, I wanted to show you that too. We were under Windows Remote Management, Windows Components, Windows Remote Management, and then we're under the service and the client, and this is where you can allow CredSSP on the service and on the client. So you can centrally configure that instead of having to do it all through there. So the other thing is, because there's definitely more than one thing, when you run some of these commands, like let's say you were going to do this with enter PS session, you have to make sure that you specify -authentication and specify CredSSP as the authentication mechanism. That way CredSSP gets used and this whole thing kicks in. Now if you'd like to read a lot more about this whole CRED SSP in the second hop. That free ebook, Secrets of PowerShell Remoting, which is on PowerShell.org, really dives into this and has some screenshots to walk you through it. By the way, one of the things I should mention before I leave you is the default security. And this can be a little bit tough to do. Let's get WSMAN, get PS session configuration. That's what I'm after. So this is PowerShell version 2, so it's Windows Management Framework version 2, and you can see that it has 2 endpoints set up. What I'm going to do is format this as a table with the -wrap so that we can see everything here. The permission in particular we could pull out if we wanted to. Select permission. So you can see that on PowerShell version 2, the built-in administrators group is allowed to remote in to this machine. So essentially, anybody else who you want to be able to remote in, you're going to have to modify the session configuration. You can do that with the set PS session configuration command. You would specify the configuration name, and then you would specify probably show security descriptor UI. Here's what that'll look like. Set PS session configuration, show security descriptor UI for configuration name. Now I forget what it was called. Scroll up a bit. Microsoft.PowerShell, that was it. So name Microsoft.PowerShell. What this will do, yes, I'm sure, is it'll pop this up in a GUI so you can actually see, and this is an easier place to modify this if you want to give other groups access to this particular endpoint. So no, I don't want to do anything. So that's what that looks like in Windows 7, PowerShell version 2. Windows 8, PowerShell version 3, this would also apply to Windows Server 2012. Let's run a get PS session configuration. See, this sets up more by default. I've got Microsoft.PowerShell, which is the main one, and you'll notice that built-in administrators does still have access, but there's a new group now called remote management users that's there by default. So if you don't want someone to be an administrator on this box, but you want them to be able to remote into this box, then add their user account to this machine's local remote management users. Now, one thing that I've seen customers do is, let's say they've got a help desk group and they don't want to make those folks administrators on all of their computers, but they do want to let them get in remotely and do certain things that they do have permissions for. And then in a group policy, you could actually put the domain's help desk user group, for example, into this remote management users local group on all of your computers, and that would let you set that configuration. But you'll notice that same thing applies to the workflow endpoint, the 32-bit endpoint, and the only one that's really different is this server manager workflows. That's really only allowing administrators and the interactive service to get in. So just the default permissions so that you're aware what those are. That was quite a bit of information. We went over the theory of operation, how this thing actually works, showed you how to enable it manually and via group policy, and also covered some of its basic configuration options. And I showed you some of its basic usage. Keep those 2 commands in mind. Enter PS session and invoke command. We're going to be using these a lot over the next several nuggets, and they're going to come up over and over again throughout the rest of this series. So it's really important that you've got those things firmly planted, burned right into the front of your brain. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you.